The Middle Way Podcast with Pat and Saman.
I just want to say hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us again on the Middle Way Podcast. And we want to welcome our special guest today, Shawn Buckley, who is a constitutional lawyer and president of the Natural Health Products Protection Association. Welcome, Shawn.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. And we wanted to talk to you, I guess, about a number of things today. Constitutional issues in the light of the current environment are obviously a big part of that. But we thought it might help just sort of ordinary folks who wonder how legal or constitutional issues perhaps impact them. It might help just to frame things a little bit. We did an interview, I think you saw it perhaps, with Dr. Jessica Rose, where we were talking about adverse effects and that sort of thing. And since then, I spoke a little bit about the heart issues I've been having since I got vaccinated. I had one dose of the vaccine, and I spoke about it in that interview. And we asked people just to let us know if they've had any issues or reactions. And we had so many people respond. I've talked to a lot of people who've had adverse reactions themselves, and we've heard from people, and whether they've had adverse reactions or not, who really had, issues with either taking another dose of the vaccine or getting vaccinated at all, and so have then had to deal with the whole passport system and not being able to not just use public amenities, but in some cases, folks that have lost their jobs, can't travel, are really concerned about getting their kids vaccinated to go back to school, that sort of thing, or they don't want to continue taking sort of continual boosters to have to qualify if that becomes a mandatory part of the system. So a lot of concerns, and there were some questions that folks wrote in, and I think they kind of speak a little bit to the whole issue of the legal side of it and the constitutional side. So one person wrote, "So why is the government doing this when they've admitted that Omicron has changed the pandemic to an endemic and the medical system is going to start treating it like a flu? How can the government continue to push these vaccines and mandates on us over a flu? I feel like we've lost all our rights. What's happened to our country? Do we have any rights left anymore? What can ordinary citizens and Canadians do to stop this insanity?" So those are a couple of the comments and questions.
So can I just weigh in on that, because it's interesting as my phone rings off the hook whenever the government is going to impose a new thing. So when BC was first announcing that they were going to mandate for healthcare workers that they had to be vaccinated, my phone started ringing off the hook. And the government knows all of this is illegal. All of this stuff is illegal. It's just been in my opinion, a criminal enterprise from day one. And, people are thinking, oh, well, let's start a lawsuit. Let's do this, let's do that. And, just kind of ignoring the point that, well, okay, that's not going to save your job, though, because by the time we walk through a lawsuit, we're years down the road. And I'm not saying don't start lawsuits, because we have to fight back every way we can. I think every citizen has a responsibility to put pressure on every place they can. I just wrote 2 letters today to 2 major news outlets just asking, or suggesting they start investigating, how authorities, including themselves, are going to be liable criminally when, if it does turn out that this has been a huge misadventure, and that's being as generous as I could possibly be based on the data that's coming in. So, but obviously I'm doing that to let them know that they're not going to walk away from this scot-free, that people have to start thinking about, people that have been hurting other people have to start thinking about, well, is there any liability that they're facing? But the whole thing has been a criminal enterprise from the beginning. And, I found myself, telling people, I don't think that the Queen's courts are going to save us from the Queen, because it literally is the Queen and that's doing this. All our governments are doing this in her name, and you read our actual Constitution. She's got a lot of power there. We call ourselves a democracy. I never have. Anyone who hasn't read our Constitution. But no, it's just I think that the truckers are showing us that, well, and I think this whole enterprise has shown us we don't have rights. And why we don't have rights is because we haven't been taught that you only have those rights that you're actually willing to stand up and pay the cost for, even if that's your life or liberty. You don't have freedoms if you're not willing to stand up. On, you know, my business email, I have a quote from a former slave that basically says, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Find out how much a population will, you know, endure, and you find out the exact measure of basically how they're going to be oppressed. Like what we're seeing is the government will push us and push us and push us until we say no. I mean, who could have imagined 2 years ago that we would be prisoners in our home, that we would be vilified if we actually chose to show our face in a public space without it being covered?
Yeah, incredible.
I mean, it's fantastic.
You know, it's interesting too. I talked to a lot of vaccinated friends, and you know, sometimes they're sympathetic, sort of in principle, but they really don't feel like it's affected them. They feel like, what's the complaint? What have you lost? It's no big deal. And it seems like, in a way, that the whole way that this is sort of played out is like a great bait and switch, because it sort of seemed like the whole impetus of the campaign was to demonize the unvaccinated and get the majority vaccinated, and then get them to see the unvaccinated as the problem, the ones that were prolonging the pandemic, which obviously Omicron is now showing is not the case. But that was the campaign, to get people looking at the unvaccinated that way, so that they could then justify those restrictions against the unvaccinated, and people would go along with them willingly, gleefully, gladly. Yeah, absolutely. Let's limit their rights. Let's shut them down. Let's not let them do this or that or the other, thinking, well, that doesn't pertain to me. That's a good thing, without realizing, and the bait and switch part of it is, you just gave away your own rights. And the government can do anything they want. At that point, they can say, now you need to put this in your body, or you need to do that, or you need to do this. And the moment you don't, you're now on the other side of the fence. You're in that non-citizen group.
Your point is so strong, because first of all, is people have to understand that they've been put into this atmosphere of fear, and you can't make rational decisions. Like when this thing first started, you know, I actually thought, no, this is like a real thing. And I was on it before it hit the news, because in my law firm, we do a lot of work for natural health product companies, and we had some clients having supply issues from China. So I start watching what's going on there, and I'm thinking, here we have a police state, and, you know, they keep their citizens happy by increasing their standard of living, so that they'll tolerate not having freedoms until the noose is too tight, that, you know, with this social credit system, and that it's really got to be a big explosion for them to free themselves. But their legitimacy depends on standard of living, and they're locking down hundreds of millions of people at a time. I actually, you know, thought this was a scary thing. And I'm watching the news at the very beginning, and I just had to make a decision. I can't watch this anymore, true or not. Although as soon as 10 days in, they started talking about the word vaccine crept in the same sentence as coronavirus. And I'm in the drug approval world. They've spent billions of dollars over a long period of time trying to get a vaccine for a coronavirus, and they never have. And think of the money involved. If they could get governments to pay for 2 flu shots each season, an influenza one and a coronavirus one, because, you know, roughly 20% of our flus each year in the flu season are coronavirus. Tons of money there. Well, they've never gone through the animal studies because too many animals die. Now, they solved that problem this time by not doing animal studies. And anyone who's read the Nuremberg Code, you don't start human trials until you've done animal studies to inform you on the safety issues. You can't read the Nuremberg Code and miss that one. So, from the very beginning,
John, do you think most people know that they know that there were no animal trials at all?
No, they don't. And most people don't know that you can't. Can anyone here on this call, can any of your listeners tell us what the ingredients are? It's a rhetorical question because the total ingredients have not been disclosed to anyone. Go to your pharmacist and ask to see the insert that comes to the pharmacist, not the public one, that's supposed to give the pharmacist the information that they need. So you tell me which pharmacist in Canada is not committing criminal negligence by injecting people with an experimental vaccine, which the pharmacist doesn't know what's in it, let alone being able to inform the patient. Like, help me out here. Which one is not committing criminal negligence? Is there a single one that's like, let's say this does turn out to be so horrifically dangerous that the initial reports of deaths and disablement continue to skyrocket as this goes forward. Is there going to be a pharmacist in Canada who's not in jail? And I just need to get back to your first question, though, or what you were saying. It was so important that people are giving up their rights and not thinking of what's going on. So these people have been put in such fear by watching the mainstream media that they just willingly take a vaccine without, they had to change the definition of vaccine to call it a vaccine. So traditionally we wouldn't call it a vaccine. So I'll call it the jab, because I'm still accustomed to the definition we used until this experimental jab came up. But people are in such fear, they've taken it. Now, okay, so let's say you've decided this is the decision I want to make, because I respect personal health decisions, whether you research or whether you don't. But the only reason you're supporting the government pressure to get everyone else to do what you've chosen to do is because you agree with this one. But now we have a precedent. Now we have a precedent that the government decides serious medical conditions for us. All they have to do is create fear. So what happens then when it's a medical decision that you don't approve of? What if you got your 12-year-old double vaxxed and your 12-year-old's almost disabled now, and the government's saying, oh, your 12-year-old needs a booster? How do you feel about it now? Or what about it when it's, the next treatment for the next scare, and you're actually convinced that, no, this isn't good for me or my family? You're not going to be so proud and so happy that you gave this up. Nobody in Canada should be going to a business that is requiring you to show ID papers to access the business. Who are you? Who are you to get vaccinated so that you can fly when others can't? How dare you? And how dare you as a business owner? Oh, I'm going to go to business. Yes, you are. And it's a sad thing because the other business owners aren't doing it. But how dare you? You're all going to be ashamed when this is done. And you should be ashamed.
Well, I think so many people are really wondering about what else they can do at this point. Whether they've, it's interesting. I talked to a number of friends who got double vaxxed. Some of them have gotten lined right up for the boosters. They were happy to do that, but a lot of people are actually hesitating and going, well, where does it end? How many more do I need to take to keep my passport, to keep this sort of status? And they're seeing with Omicron, I think when I spoke to Julia earlier, she had mentioned a doctor in Quebec who was saying, we don't need a booster. Omicron is the booster. It's the one. Everybody's going to catch it. It's like a common cold or the flu, and it will bring much better immunity. So why do we need? So that's what I'm hearing from some fully vaccinated friends who are hesitating at the boosters. Why do I need a booster? And why is the government still pushing boosters so hard in the light of Omicron? They really, that's the question, is the $1 million question, is why is that campaign seemed not to let up, whether the truck, all 50,000 trucks roll to Ottawa or, however many Canadians. I think the latest poll showed more and more Canadians are sort of dropping off the booster bandwagon and want restrictions lifted. I think over 50% want the restrictions lifted now. So why is the booster campaign still so? That's the mystery. I don't understand that in the light of Omicron.
Well, I think you do understand it. You just don't want to say it. And I'm not going to say it either. But, these policies leave much to be desired and have throughout. Like in this, cult of science, like, do people not understand that you can manipulate science to say whatever you want? And the mainstream media is not giving you the science. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the whole thing doesn't make sense. There's been, in my opinion, if you look at this from start to finish, the whole thing was designed to create fear, to corral us into getting these experimental jabs. And they are experimental. I mean, I was visiting a friend the other day for coffee, and she works in a school. And most of the teachers were sick because this Omicron, or, there's also common colds and stuff going around. It is the low vitamin D season that we call flu season in the Northern Hemisphere. And all the staff are so happy that they've gotten their double jab, and in some cases the boosters. They're sick. They're sick. But they're saying, oh my gosh, I'd be so much more sick if I hadn't gotten the shots. Where's the evidence on that? Help me out. Really? We've run clinical trials to show that symptoms are lower for people that have been vaccinated than people that. Do you really believe this? Like, the lack of critical thought is just astronomical.
Yeah, people do believe it.
It's just astronomical. And these parents, I mean, COVID hits us up till today, or let's say up till 3 months ago, because, I think there was something with this Delta variant that knocked some people on their backs. I knew of one person up till about 3 months ago. I knew of one person that was sick enough from COVID that they had to stay home from work for a couple of days. I didn't know anyone who was disabled, and I didn't know anyone who died, or of anyone in my circle that I didn't know, but, oh yeah, my dad died or my uncle died. I'm not saying there weren't, I'm just saying in my circle, that was my experience. Now, if you were to ask me, well, do I know people who I'm pretty confident died from getting the vaccine or who are disabled? Yes, I actually know several people who are disabled, and there are, a number of people that I believe have died from the vaccine. And I know some young people that are disabled. I know of one young lady, 31, she can't stand up because her heart's so wrecked. She physically can't stand up, and she was a fitness instructor. Like, so we're getting injured. And I think that parents, if they open their eyes, that my experience will be similar to others, that there's enough reports of people being injured that you would have to ask yourself, for vaccinating a child, like, first question is there a report of a single child in the world dying of Omicron, the one going around? I mean, there's how many reports worldwide, let's just ignore Canada, of people under 12 who have died of COVID. Like, I think, I haven't crunched this, but it's likely that your chances of a young person dying from a lightning strike might be higher, because you always have to do a relative risk analysis, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, oh, my child's in danger. Well, relative to what? Relative to what? Because, like I said, I haven't crunched the numbers, but some kids die, let's say in a 5-year period, kids in Canada die from being struck by lightning, and that number might be more than ones that we would clearly attribute to COVID. Now, it's experimental. You don't, so there's really no risk for your kids. It's experimental. The data is clearly coming in, don't do this. Expert after expert saying there's no medical case for vaccinating kids. And so if a parent does that, is a parent criminally liable? Can I just read to you the definition of criminal negligence?
Please do. Yeah.
And then I'd like to talk to you about employers. So 219 of the Canadian Criminal Code defines what criminal negligence is, and then later sections depending on the results, so there's criminal negligence causing bodily harm and then criminal negligence causing death. And the penalty is higher for death than bodily harm. So 219 of the criminal code, everyone is criminally negligent who, in doing anything, or in omitting to do anything that it's his duty to do, shows wanton or reckless disregard for the lives and safety of others. Now, parents have a duty to take care of their kids and be reasonably informed in making health decisions for their kids. I mean, let's say outside of COVID, you go to a doctor and the doctor goes, well, there's this emergency authorization treatment for something. I can't tell you what the ingredients are. There's lots of reports of people dying and being seriously injured. And the risk to your child from this disease of dying or being seriously injured is really nothing. Will you take this? Let's give this shot to your kid. I mean, you tell me you're not committing criminal negligence if you say yes. Well, how is that different from what's going on here? These employers that are saying, I'm going to fire you unless you get jabbed, they're forcing their staff to make a medical decision. And they'll say, no, I don't have the authority to tell them to do it. It's still their personal choice. Yeah, they got 5 kids and a mortgage, and their kids are going to be on the street and starving in 3 weeks if they lose their job. They have a choice. Mm-hmm. You're choosing to impose a medical decision on them. Oh, employer, have you looked into the data? You're basically telling them they're going to lose their job unless they take an experimental treatment, the data of which was not presented honestly anyway. And I'm sorry, I forget the name of the group, but if you watch the Joe Rogan interview with Dr. Malone, which everyone on this planet should watch, he refers to a group in Canada of doctors that have actually done a presentation that you can watch online on the Pfizer vaccine, and they're pointing out how when this first came out and they're saying like 95% efficacy, well, they're using a specific risk analysis. What they're not telling you is it's like less than 1% or around 1% that it's going to prevent you from being hospitalized or death. Like the difference is if they said, oh, well, they take this experimental drug and you might have a 1% difference, no one would take it. And then even those numbers weren't fair. I mean, Pfizer's already acknowledged that they underreported the deaths in the vaccine group, and we're talking with such small numbers anyway that the numbers aren't meaningless. And then they unblinded the trial for the unvaccinated group. So now we don't even have ongoing information. It's just everyone out there who's vaccinated is the clinical trial.
Yeah, I was going to say too about those odds, and in terms of people getting the information. I read somewhere with Omicron, and this is something I don't think most people realize because they're not being told it this way, like you're saying, that the odds with Omicron of having serious illness or hospitalization are about 2 in 1,000. That was roughly the data was showing. But the revised, the actual data from the trials, as you're talking about, from the mRNA trials that came out that wasn't disclosed at the time, there were about 30% of adverse reactions. So out of 1,000, your chances with Omicron are 2 out of 1,000. If people are actually presented this data, your chances are 2 out of 1,000 with Omicron of ending up in hospital or serious illness. There are 300 out of 1,000 of having some kind of adverse reaction, which could be chronic or life-threatening ultimately. If people were presented it that way, it'd be like, whoa, it's a simple choice. But that's not at all how it's being presented. And of course, that data that you're quoting and you're talking about that came to light about those original clinical trials is not, most people don't know.
No, and one of the things, and everyone who actually looks at published research and listens to experts that are cautious, you just can't get your head around the group of people that it's almost like they're in a trance. I mean, I use the word spell. It's like they're in a spell. And I think there's a large part of the population, and I was in this group before, there's a large part of the population that they turn on the mainstream news and they actually think that this is an authoritative source for anything. They don't understand they're there to make money, and that, you know, this responsibility that we expected long ago of balanced journalism, that's been gone for a long time. Like, was it the early 80s or late 70s when Canada and all the other Western nations repealed laws that limited concentration of ownership in media outlets? I mean, I was just a teenager back then, and I knew that was a problem. But unless, you know, you got to get your head around the fact that the media lies. Like for me, my, you know, road to Damascus moment actually was during the Kuwait War, where remember, so, you know, Iraq invades Kuwait, and I forget who broke it, CNN or NBC or whatever, several major ones, media outlets carried it about Iraqi soldiers throwing Kuwaiti babies out of bassinets in the intensive care ward, you know, the neonatal intensive care wards of the hospital. Do you guys remember that story?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're shaking your head. Well, I remember just being outraged, like, holy cow, like, these people are animals. They're killing, you know, premature babies in a neonatal ward in a hospital. And, you know, we've got this nurse from Kuwait testifying about this happening. Well, she was no nurse. She was the US ambassador's daughter who hadn't been to her country in years. The whole thing was an absolute fraud, the whole thing. And, you know, the government's declassified, like the US government, they get into the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, it was all a staged event. You got to get your head around the idea that the mainstream media now and again totally lies. And you have a responsibility if you're making decisions for your children. You can kill yourself all you want, but if you're making decisions for your children, that is not an authoritative source. And I was going to say Google, but you can't Google. You got to go to DuckDuckGo or some other search engine, because you open two screens and search in Google and search with the other search, you get different results. The censorship is just outrageous. But you have a responsibility to inform yourself. If you're a parent and you're making decisions for your kids, you have a responsibility. And if you've got this idea in your head that you turn on the TV and you're getting the truth, start checking. I mean, even the term anti-vax, like, are people too stupid to realize that that is a pejorative term being put out by the mainstream media to basically discredit information without you actually listening to it? It's a term that causes you to close your mind. Oh, they're an anti-vaxxer, meaning I'm not going to listen. It's actually, it hurts you because it closes your mind.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't close the other person's mind, but you're being trained not to listen to a group of people because of a label that's been given. You've been manipulated.
You know, it's so true.
Labels, and you don't even understand it. And I keep hearing people say anti-vaxxer, anti-vaccine, or anti-vaxxer. Like, you know, you'll find yourselves in, you know, different crowds of people, and it's always pejorative.
Yeah, I had the same thing occur with me. When this whole thing started, I believed in the vaccines. I'd had a bad vaccine reaction many years before. So I was a little hesitant at first, but I believed what the media was telling me. That I believed the sun set on CNN, and I got all my news from those sources. And so I believed. I believed what I researched online. I believed that the vaccines were fully safe. I believed all the efficacy they were reporting. I bought the anti-vaxxer narrative. I thought those people were crazy and conspiracy nuts and all the rest of it. I was right down that, which I realize now that was the rabbit hole. That was so I was 100% with that. And then when I had my vaccine reaction and started to actually investigate and talk to people who were having reactions and had looked at the research from a more independent scientific point of view and weren't sort of swallowing the mainstream narrative, it began to open my eyes and change things. And now I talk to friends who are, you know, exactly where I was. And I go, man, I know, I thought exactly the same thing. I thought they're all crazy, conspiracy, it's all nuts. And, you know, why would these mainstream networks not be telling me the truth? I've trusted them all my life. And it's And that's part of the thing, I think, is it's hard. It was real. I'll just speak from my own experience. It was really hard to let go of that, the bubble I was in. That's certainly, I felt like that was my, the world is safe within this belief system, that I can trust the news, that I'm one of the majority, that I can always trust the government more or less, all of these things. And so to have that kind of stripped away, to be disillusioned of that, it's a painful process. And especially when you've trusted, your country to be, one of the sort of leading lights in most democratic and most tolerant nations, and looks after its citizens. And you just kind of think that's always going to be the case. That's the way it is. So to see, well, maybe in this case, that's not so. Maybe we could have done a better job, and it didn't happen. And so I think for me, it was like a comfort blanket, a security blanket. It was cold having that stripped away. So when I talk to friends that are still sort of right down that rabbit hole of the mainstream information, I totally relate. I understand it's a painful process, and and yet, as you're saying, there is liability, and I wanted to actually ask you to maybe speak a little bit more on that, and both that and the constitutional issues, because people are asking, what are our rights, and if we want to try to use our rights or regain our rights or whatever, what can we do?
That's actually a very good point. I've been saying from the very beginning, many, many months ago, the question I always asked was, at what point does this stop being a medical issue and become a political issue? Forcing people to get a vaccine. And now it's quite obvious that we're talking about something which is a constitutional issue. And the question that I have is, how far can we go before we realize that we've gone as far as we have? And where do we draw the line? At what point are we supposed to raise the issue that this is becoming a little bit scary? I mean, I've got both vaccines. I've got 2 kids in school right now. The thought of getting them vaccinated or not is always something that's on the top of your mind. As a parent, you want to obviously do what's best for your kids, and I don't know what decision to make. But I don't want to be forced into that decision at the very least. And if I'm forced into this decision, what are the other decisions that we're going to be forced to make later on?
Yeah, and I mean, I think we need to be clear. We are being forced, right? Like, it's not like the government's passed the law yet, but they'd want to, if they think they could, mandating it. If you're breaking the law unless you take whatever jabs we tell you to take. They want to do that, but they haven't.
Like Austria has, right?
Yeah, I believe they have. I believe a few countries have. Now, so they're playing this little game. It's kind of like, when the US hires private contractors to go do things that would be illegal for their army to do. I'm sorry, how is there any difference there? How are you not personally liable for doing that? Who cares whether you're paying the soldier or a third party is? They're there because you're asking them to go do things that are illegal. So when they're putting this, you're going to lose your job, you're a healthcare worker, a government employee, or you can't fly, or you can't enter public spaces. Well, we have a choice, but we really don't have a choice. I mean, I know so many people, to save their job, took the jab when they didn't want to take the jab. And you guys it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So this hasn't been voluntary. Now let's turn to our charter rights. So in 1982, so we really have 2 major constitutional documents: the British North America Act of 1867, which is the main part of our Constitution, defining the provinces and federal governments and their different jurisdictions and all of that. But then remember, with Pierre Trudeau, or our current Führer's stepfather, Pierre Trudeau, when he was prime minister, we brought in this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I'll just indicate, one of the premiers, Brian Peckford, is going to court to ask the court to basically enforce this charter. And I think Mr. Peckford should know that a lot of us are really proud of him and support what he's doing. So, but turning to the charter. So Section 2C, we've got freedom of peaceful assembly. That means that we should be allowed, we have a constitutional right to assemble together however we want to do this. This isn't just for political. This can be for whatever groups we want to peacefully assemble. Well, I'm getting married on Saturday. I have a strict Alberta Health Services limit on how many people I can invite. I've lost my right for peaceful assembly, even on that. Well, there's a whole bunch of places that unvaccinated people can't go. So we've lost that right. Section 6, every citizen, I'll quote it, every citizen of Canada has the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada. Every citizen. Well, right now, that's every citizen who has taken every jab of an experimental treatment that the government says they need to take. And very soon that's going to be 3, right? Well, that's not what our Constitution says. You're unvaccinated. You can't even fly within Canada, let alone leave Canada. It's an outrageous violation of that part of the Constitution. Section 9, everyone has the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. Keyword that the government would use to get around on that is arbitrarily. But you try to enter Canada and you test wrong or don't have the right papers, you're in a Trudeau hotel, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's just outrageous. Wasn't it Mr. Hillier, an MLA in Ontario, that was asking questions last year in the legislature about why are camps being built in Ontario? Who are those camps for? I have a friend in Alberta who is involved in a business that, does trailers for the oil patch. The government of Canada has bought every trailer they have and they're being outfitted for camps. So who are these camps for? Are Canadians listening? Like, you don't support the truckers because you're watching the mainstream media basically call them names? Like, that's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you gone and talked to these people? Are you looking at the Twitter posts and seeing who these people are? Are you seeing what the Ottawa police are saying about them, which is all good things?
It's interesting when you're talking about the restriction of travel rights. I have friends that one friend who was unvaccinated who came back from a trip abroad, and she lives alone. And so when she arrived, immigration told her that she would have to go into one of these, quarantine hotels. And she lives alone. She's like, I have my own place. Why would I have to go and spend money? I just came back from a trip, right? I've spent money. Why would I go and stay in a hotel? I can stay in quarantine at home. And they said, no, that was just that. And apparently they have complete arbitrary, as you highlighted that word, authority just to say, no, we don't think that's sufficient for quarantine. So you've got to go into the hotel, or perhaps at one point a camp, as you said, if it gets large enough or if it continues in this direction. And so she said no. And so she got fined $5,000. So she had to go to court about that. So yeah, it's, it's happening.
Yeah. So, back to Section 9, that, we have the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned, and back to these camps. And, sorry, I just got a little emotional about it. So
no problem.
Every Canadian needs to turn everything off in the house, no radio, no TV, no computer, sit down so they have some quiet to think and just ask themselves, how is this going to end well for my children and my grandchildren that I'm allowing camps to be built in Canada? I'm allowing camps, internment camps to be built. And how does that end well for your kids? I don't care where you are on this. How does that end well for your kids? How does having to show ID papers when you go to a restaurant or a hockey game, how is that going to end well for your kids? Help me out here. And that's back to how dare you go to a hockey game? How dare you go to a restaurant? I don't care if you have a passport or not. Obviously, if you don't, you can't go. But how dare you? How dare you do that? Because that's going to lead to a social credit system where our kids won't even know what freedom was. They're going to be so afraid.
Just to back up, I know Simon's going to say had something to say in a moment as well, but I just wanted to say, a lot of people may hear that and go, I don't believe there's camps in Canada, or there would be camps. One thing, and we can maybe do this as a link with the interview underneath, is that there's been news programs out of Australia actually showing people in that kind of camp. So they're already institutionalized there, and those are quarantine camps for various reasons down there, travel, whatever, coming back in, coming out, or they just feel that you got COVID and so we're sending you to the camp. So it's already happening, and I think if people look at the link we'll put underneath the video, they'll see it's not a fantasy. It's actually
and you might want to find the link to Mr. Hillier's questions in the legislature. I think people might find that instructive.
Absolutely. There was a great I'll just throw this in before you, Simon, if I can. John Brassard yesterday, the Conservative MP, he took the government to task for spying on 33 million Canadians and accessing their public health records illegally. So, and the government's pushing these digital IDs now. And I remember seeing one of the truckers who were involved with that protest and the convoy saying that when he rolled up to the border, the US-Canadian border, he's double vaccinated.
I saw that video.
Yeah, so he pulled up and they were just like waving him through, and he goes, how do you know I'm, and he goes, that's all right. We've through the QR code, they saw him coming. So basically they're tracking. So that told him, wow. So the government is tracking everyone through their phone. And so they know basically where you're going and what you're doing.
And what your health records are.
And what your health records are. And thus, if you are allowed to use these facilities, if you're allowed to cross a border, if you're allowed to do this, if you're allowed to work, if you're allowed to do, where there's a mandatory vaccine policy, all those things now they're tracking via your phone and your QR code. And if they tell you to stay in your house, they can track if they leave.
It's, I spoke to and sorry, I'm just trying to keep.
Yeah. There's too much light on you, Shawn.
But anyway, I spoke to one gentleman personally who has some hacking skills, and he and some other hackers went behind the Alberta QR code, and they said, well, it's easy to get in there and peek around, but what they were hoping to be able to do were to be able to generate fake codes that the system would recognize. But encryption or something actually goes back to IBM. So he says the architecture, this is IBM, which is appropriate because IBM, am I wrong? IBM did the identification tracking of the people in the Holocaust who were killed, right? Didn't they set that up for the Germans? I think it was IBM. So I could be wrong, and if I am, I apologize to IBM. I'm not trying to suggest. I'm saying I haven't verified that. But in my readings over the years, I was a bit of a history buff. I think they were involved. But anyway, so they're not able to generate fake QR codes that are going to work. But they say, the architecture's in place where they just, basically flick the switch, and then all of a sudden 2 isn't enough. You have to 3, and it's set up to have shot after shot after shot. And Canada, I haven't verified this. I just came across it in a news feed yesterday where it's showing how many countries, how much vaccines they've ordered going forward. And basically we have, enough for 10 shots or something. We've bought more than anyone else in the world per population. And, it'd be enough for like 10 shots or something. So why are we one of the worst countries? Like, why Canada? So it's somewhat pleasing that we're starting this freedom rebellion with the truckers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just, you were talking a moment ago about QR codes and why are we tracking that sort of thing in Canada, and why have we bought so much of the vaccine? The other, it was about the vaccine. So the vaccines they bought, because we had done, I think, as you saw the interview with Jessica Rose, Dr. Jessica Rose, but also Dr. Anna Blakeney here with UBC, and she's in the program developing the new generation of vaccines. But as far as we know, those aren't the ones that the country has bought. That the vaccines that they have an inventory of that they're pushing for the boosters are the ones that already have proven don't work against Omicron.
Mm-hmm.
So the insanity of that somehow isn't registered on people. They think, oh yeah, a booster for something, it's still the old batch. It's still the one that doesn't work for that variant.
Yeah.
So, if 2 or 3 didn't work, 4 is not going to work if it's not set up, it's not designed for that particular variant. And that variant is mild. So why do you need a booster anyway? And so anyway, I mean, a flu booster, okay, but when in the past, I mean, have we ever in our history, we've had flu season and there's flu shots available. I don't remember anyone ever saying, you don't get your flu shot, you're going to lose all these rights. You're going to be ostracized. You may lose your job. You won't be able to travel. And you have to go into some kind of a quarantine hotel or camp if you try, or if you refuse to get the shot. Or you might be fined, like they're doing in Austria, or setting up to do in Austria, fined or jailed because you didn't get your flu shot.
Well, hey, I mean, Quebec was going to fine people. I think they're backing off on that now. That might just be today or yesterday, but I mean, Quebec had announced previously that you were going to get fined unless you got the jab. And, and that's total coercion. But from the very beginning, I mean, before we even had the vaccine, they were talking vaccine. And as I say, those of us in the drug approval world were going, what? And we're waiting for the journalists to do research and discover, no, it's not realistic to make a coronavirus vaccine in 5 years, let alone in 1 year. Like, talk to someone in the drug approval world. You're not going to get any. We've never succeeded. How would we expect to succeed in an emergency? Having no idea that. Yeah. Anyway, so the whole thing from start to finish has been to generate fear and funnel everyone into this single solution, and it's not a solution, but this single perceived solution of getting jab after jab after jab. And it's been that way early on. That's where we were going before the approvals, before the evidence of harm. The longer we go, the more clear it's becoming that this is a train wreck. This is a train wreck. And then the relentless censorship and ridiculing of anyone who opposes this agenda. And when you can't have free speech, there's something wrong. There's something wrong. Listen, let's say we get through this and years go by and we've recovered and, some truly scary virus comes out. Like, we're talking, this is something that's going to kill 20% of the population. Oh my gosh, we're forcing unemployed people to train in utilities so our gas flow keeps going and our lights go on in January. So our furnace, like, we're in an emergency. How would we best do that? Would we say, well, let's have a small group in the government decide the only way we're going to try and address this, and one size fits all for the whole friggin' world, basically, and we can't have any debate about it. Anyone who disagrees with this is going to be ridiculed and censored out of nowhere. And if they're a professional, they're going to be destroyed. They're going to have their right to practice their profession taken away. Or do you think we might have better health outcomes by going, look, this is going to be a real mess. This is going to be a train wreck. We don't know what the best solution is. Let's have open dialogue. Even the silly ideas, fine, they're going to be discarded. Aren't we mature enough as a society, as a world society, to have open and honest debate and maybe let different countries and different provinces and different cities try different things and see what works. But we've got like the exact opposite here. Like, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to go, you're going to have better health outcomes if we have open debate. We have, respectful debate, sure. Like if something's kooky, we're going to, and try different things and see. My God, we're being told this is a health emergency and we can't talk about alternatives. We can't talk about published research, and there's lots of it now on ivermectin, for example. You can't talk about it. And if you're a physician and you actually follow the science and use ivermectin, you're going to lose your license to practice. What? And we're going to have good health outcomes? No, we're not. Like the whole thing from start to finish has just, we're in crazy land. I keep hoping I'm going to wake up and go, oh, that was a vivid dream.
It's like Seinfeld's Bizarro World. I know, it's so strange. And when you're talking about the constitutional aspect as well, and
oh yes, I didn't finish with that.
No, that's good. I was just going to say, we mentioned before, we'd love to have you on again with Brian Peckford if possible, to talk about that in more detail. But we'd love to hear your thoughts on, well, just what that case may accomplish, or what the hope of a case like that may accomplish, what ordinary Canadians can do to support that, or to try and somehow support our Charter of Rights.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots that people could do. I mean, obviously what Mr. Peckford is trying to do is, I think it's not just the lawsuit. I also think it's to draw attention to what's happening, because he knows the lawsuit's going to take a long time to grind through. But here we are talking about it, talking about a premier who was actually involved in drafting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, going to court to say, we're violating this, and we've got to get back to our fundamental law. I mean, Section 52 of the Constitution Act of 1982 reads, the Constitution is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the Constitution is of no force and effect. There's no ambiguity there. You're violating the Constitution, any law that's violating the Constitution or government action, because it only applies to government. It's of no force and effect. I mean, Mr. Peckford's going to be successful, but that's going to be down the road. So understand that's valuable, that he's doing it, and he's publicly doing it, and he's talking about what he's doing is adding to this debate about, well, what kind of country do we want to live in? Because as awful as this is, the beautiful thing is all of us, for the first time in our lives, actually have to choose, who are we going to be? Because your actions make a difference. You go to that restaurant and flash your QR code, you're putting your kids towards police state and Chinese social credit. Full stop. No ambiguity there. You want to go to that friggin' hockey game, you show your QR code, you are marching your children and your grandchildren to a police state. There's no ambiguity there. You're choosing who you are going to be and the type of country your kids are going to live in. So we get to choose. This is really important. For those of us that believe we're here to learn lessons and choose who we're going to be, you're choosing right now, whether you know it or not. This is a pivot point in history right now. And people like Brian Peckford are standing forward and trying to make a difference, and you need to. You have to start putting pressure on the other side. Like today, I wrote 2 letters to the media asking, are you guys going to be liable? Like, very polite. Don't threaten, don't get emotional, but you let people know they're going to be held to account. Don't email. How many times have you called your premier or health minister? It might take you a while to actually, you're not going to get to talk to them, but it might take you a while, but you'll be able to talk to one of the persons in their office, and you tell them you don't like what's happening. Vaccinated or unvaccinated, it doesn't matter. You tell them you don't like what's happening, and they'll disagree with you, but you're putting pressure on them, and you're taking time from their day to say, I don't approve of this. There's rallies in every city across Canada, likely on Saturday. How many are you attending? And how many people are you inviting? And are you financially supporting pressure groups? Like you guys probably need financial support. I know the Natural Health Product Protection Association that I'm involved, we need financial support. Probably Mr. Peckford needs financial support. The truckers need financial support. You got to support people financially. We're in an information war. We're in a rights war. If we don't stand up, they're gone. I mean, they've been taken from us. We thought we had them because we misunderstood you don't have rights just because the government tells you you have rights. You only have rights when you're willing to fight for them and you're willing to pay the cost for them. We're learning that. So who are you going to be?
You know, when you're talking about it as an information war, it really does seem like how we've had in the past political organizations described as machines. The whole sort of government lockstep with our media, which is maybe one of the most disappointing things. I never realized that our media, we always thought the media was somewhat independent. There was journalism. They were going to ask the right questions. They were going to protect people, but they're not asking any of those questions. And it just feels like a machine. It just feels like it's a machine. So when you're talking about information war, just getting information to people is so hard. And one of the bits of information that I think is important is people don't realize that the Charter of Rights was there to prevent all of this. And in that great interview we saw with Brian Peckford and Jordan Peterson, what former Minister Peckford was talking about was that the Charter of Rights, the only way that it was ever allowed, that any of those provisions could be allowed to be suspended, was under
Section 1.
Yes. So can you talk a little bit about that, and where maybe that has been kind of...
So here's the problem, and obviously Mr. Peckford, he's the authority on this right now. But you know, for those of us that were following at the time and reading books post, you know, charter, our understanding, my understanding was, and I can be wrong, is that, you know, here you've got these leaders, they're, you know, literally like the fathers of confederation on this issue. What rights do you have? What rights don't you have? And there were two sticking points: property rights. So in, you know, Diefenbaker's Canadian Bill of Rights, which, you know, really was the watershed, and especially for, you know, some minority populations that were, you know, confined to reservations, it opened the door for them, this Bill of Rights, but it protects property rights too. Now, the courts did not give the Bill of Rights its due, and it really became a meaningless document, although that wasn't the intention. But they didn't put property rights into our Charter of Rights. Big mistake for the people. Big mistake. You don't have property rights, it's really hard to defend your freedoms when you're dependent on the government. And the second issue is, well, when you have a disagreement on a fundamental issue and you call yourself a democracy, although you're an elected autocracy, who has the final say? The courts or the politicians that are in theory enforcing the will of the people? Well, the politicians chose the politicians. And this is then the Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms reads, and I quote, "The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it," and here's the nefarious part, "subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society." So that's the mischief. So, oh yeah, we guarantee these rights, but subject to, you know, such reasonable limits prescribed by laws can be demonstrably justified in free and democratic society. So they have to pass a law, and then, you know, like a lawyer like me, when we go to court, it's the battle isn't proving that the government's violated a charter right. Where you lose, where the real fight is can they justify it somehow? Mm-hmm. And, you know, so the courts have come up with tests. You know, the leading case originally and still is Regina versus Oakes, which kind of has this three-part analysis. It's been tweaked by other decisions, but that's where we lose on our rights.
Because they say,
and let me just say something else.
Well, I just want to just point out what you just said, just highlight. You said, so they're basically saying if the government can suspend any of these rights, if they believe there's a reason, they have reasonable cause, basically, to do that there's something that they believe it's reasonable in their estimation to pass a law.
Yeah, and the court's gonna require them to justify that. So, for example, it has to be proportional. If you can convince a court, yeah, no, we should be allowed to do this. One of the things the court's going to look at is, well, are you causing more harm than you're trying to prevent? Like, there's this. The way the courts have gone about it is fairly rational and reasonable, considering that the government does have this override. I mean, they still have to justify it, but it's an override. But that has to be removed.
So so I guess with Brian Peckford's case, he's going to show in court that the cost of the measures they've taken are much higher than.
Well, no, the government's going to have to show. So so you show, when you go to court, you've got the onus of showing a charter violation. And that's usually pretty easy, in the case of the lawsuit. Once you've done that, then the onus switches to the government to then show that this restriction is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So, small difference, but the onus isn't on Mr. Peckford. It's then going to be on the government. So
the government will have to prove that they've saved more lives and prevented more damage through the measures they've taken than have been cost as a side effect of the measures they've taken, whether those are lockdowns, loss of employment, other kinds of illnesses or deaths that have been incurred as a result of those policies. So they're going to have to show that whatever measures they took were better on balance than the cost.
Yeah, no, and bearing in mind, this is just kind of like ex post facto by the time it gets heard, kind of legal analysis on what's happened. So, but it's interesting. The thought just came to me while we're having this discussion, my experience as a lawyer in court. I mean, I was called to the bar in 1995. I've for sure run over 1,000 trials, and some of them months long, and focused heavily on constitutional rights. And I've already, recited to you Section 52 of the Constitution Act 1982. The Constitution of Canada is the supreme law of Canada, and any law that is inconsistent with the Constitution is of no force and effect. Now, every Attorney General is supposed to uphold the law and have their Department of Justice uphold the law. And here we have our Constitution Act 1982, Section 52, saying the Constitution, and that includes the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's in the same act, is the supreme law of Canada. I have never in my career seen a Department of Justice lawyer support charter rights. 100% of the time when I've been arguing for some constitutional remedy because rights are violated, and sometimes just the violations are egregious. I mean, they're just outrageous, and we've got a lawyer or team of lawyers on the other side, because if it's a big case, I've had cases where it's me against 12 other lawyers. It's like if you're touching a nerve, it's a team. Always arguing in court to restrict our rights. Now, how on earth does the Department of Justice, charged with enforcing our law, and the supreme law of Canada includes our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, 100% of the time arguing in court to restrict the rights? It's so hard to win that only the rich can afford it. And even then, your chances of success without a great fact pattern aren't good. I mean, we have rights on paper, but the way it plays out on the ground is outrageous for people whose rights are violated and want them enforced. And that's because of the government.
And even if Brian wins his case, Brian Peckford won his case, like you said, it's years down the road. Then what does it mean or matter at that point if it's 3 or 4 years down the road?
It's still important. And like I say, the fact that he's doing it publicly and sharing it. No, this is important. We have to do, everyone has to do, you just pick how you're going to put pressure on the system. And again, I don't care which side of this vaccine unvaxxed you are. It's not good that we need ID passports. We're no different than Nazi Germany. Show us your papers. We're going to a Chinese social credit system. For people who don't understand what that is, and I was again going to say Google it. No, DuckDuckGo it, because Google will hide it, because that's where we're going. But in China, everything you do is being tracked. So, and they actually publish, well, if these behaviors are good and your score goes up, and these behaviors are bad. They've actually published that for foreign countries, and the Trudeau government actually has guidelines to help companies comply with this outrageous social credit system. We shouldn't be participating in that. But anyway, so let's say I'm a Chinese citizen and I've given this interview. Well, now I go to get on the subway to go to work tomorrow morning, and my subway pass doesn't work because their computer algorithm has realized I did something bad. It's reduced my social credit score, and now my score is below that needed for me to use the subway. I've long lost the ability to fly and access other services. And so I'm immediately punished in real time for bad behavior as defined by the government. Mm-hmm. This is total Orwell 1984. It's worse. That's where we're going. Listen, we have the largest nation on earth, one of the most powerful nations on earth, that has already imposed this on 1 billion people. And we're starting to do the same thing here. And you dare to go eat a restaurant meal and show your passport? And you dare to board a plane to Mexico so you can have a friggin' vacation? Can't you wait a year or so until this madness is done? How dare you? You're enslaving your children and your grandchildren. That's what you're doing. Like, people, how is this okay?
Yeah, and I was just, when you're giving that example about China and about if that system evolved in the direction we're talking about here, if you make a statement or publicly disagree with a policy, you can't get on public transport later, that they actually, through algorithms, could restrict and downgrade your security status. It was interesting to me because I saw not just what that trucker said crossing the border about how he was being tracked, and his vaccination status was already known at the border before he even arrived. But I know a young fellow I'm in touch with. He does some sort of work for me in overseas, and he's in Europe. And I was talking to him, and he was actually shaking his head because he's at school there, and there's some Swedish girls in the school, and they were showing him their digital ID. And I don't know if it was a bracelet or on their skin or something like that, but he was like, it's wild. Like, they were really like, look, I got my digital ID. And so some places, I don't know if it was Sweden. But it was one of those Northern European countries. So there are these policies, and then I saw Saskatchewan put out a tender for companies to create the digital ID system there. So these things, they may be going hand in hand. Like, well, our rights are being restricted. At the same time, there seems to be this movement to track us.
If you think for a second that this isn't just another step to the social credit system, I have some oceanfront property in Saskatchewan for sale. And you're going to be early in, so it's going to work out really well.
Absolutely. So
now, I do have to admit, the palm trees are only about 4 feet high because we only planted them 5 years ago. But it's going to be spectacular.
I think with a little bit of genetic modification, they'll be just fine. Mm-hmm. So Saman, you were trying to get a question in before?
Yeah. And I'm thinking, let's say for a second that there was a real emergency. There have been millions and millions of people who've died from the virus, and there was a reason for the government to enforce some very, very serious restrictions. Constitutionally speaking, how long and how far can those restrictions progress, and at what point are we no longer in an emergency, and can we then shut down the restrictions that they're putting in place?
Well, if they just pass a regular law and they think that they're going to sort it out through fighting it in the courts, there is no time limit on those laws. But they have another mechanism, Section 33, which is the notwithstanding clause. So they've really got two mechanisms there, but that's not a very politically popular mechanism, the notwithstanding clause. So you very seldom will see that work. So I'll just read to you Section 33. I'm just flipping to it as I was speaking to you. So Section 33 of the Constitution Act 1982. Parliament or a legislature of a province may expressly declare in an act of Parliament or the legislature, as the case may be, that the act or provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision included in Section 2 or Sections 7 to 15 of the Charter, which, most of the significant rights. So basically that not only can they violate our rights and try to justify it under Section 1, but they can actually pass a law, specifically exempting. But there's a 5-year limitation on that. So such laws would expire after 5 years. But as I say, it's not politically popular to do that because you're basically announcing we're suspending fundamental rights.
Right, because, Pat and I were talking earlier, and at a specific point in time during the pandemic, if, we take the point of view that the vaccine was something that was actually saving lives and being effective in controlling the pandemic, if the vaccine was actually doing that, then mandating everybody who wants to gather socially be safe and make sure that everybody else who's not vaccinated is also safe, that would make sense, but only for a specific period of time. The issue arises where the mandate continually gets pushed farther and farther back, and our end dates, there is no end date in sight. That is what starts to worry me personally. I mean, I'm okay with giving up certain rights for a set amount of time when I know that it's in the public good, but I'm worried about where that's going to stop, and that's I think that this is the point where I've been trying to get to throughout our entire talk, and I think what you're mentioning as well with the way that the social credit system is moving in China. When is it? How can we stop this? How can we know where to draw the line?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Saman. And I think obviously facts matter, right? So, because we all have to be able to change our mind if the facts change. So let's say we're dealing with a truly dangerous virus or something else that really was killing a lot of people and causing problems. I think everyone would feel a little different about how much rights are going to be constricted and how and for what period of time. Right? So like if we were truly in a dangerous situation, great. But when for some age groups, like there's just no harm at all, and we're trying to push them being vaccinated, and for other age groups it's really minimal, and just ignoring the evidence and censoring everyone, we feel a little differently about it. But everyone's line in the sand is a little different. I mean, I know I can't wear a mask. I'm not taking any trial work because courts are requiring lawyers to wear masks in court, and I just can't do it. I can't wear a mask all day. I'm not wired that way. And I actually personally would be willing to accept, a fair amount of risk but I don't believe there's a whole bunch of risk just based on the research that I've been reading. I've been quite involved in this. So, yeah, but I mean, I think your question is really going to depend on the facts, right? Like you were explaining earlier that, where you're struggling right now is the decisions to make for your kids. And then also a concern about, well, how many times do we do this, right? Because I think, well, and you know, I just realized I don't even know why we're having this discussion, because we only need to shut down for 15 days and we'll flatten the curve and then it's done. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Why
I was just going to say the goalposts have moved so much. It did start out sounding so reasonable,
It truly did, didn't it?
like you're saying, and then there was, you know, it's only going to be this amount of time, and then it was, oh, there'll never be a mandate, or we'll never do this. We'd never have a thing like a passport, and then we've seen all of that. So at that point, everything that they said they weren't going to do, they've done, which is why I think for folks to say, well, when you're talking about, you know, detention camps and things like that, we can't really say at this point that we can trust that any of these things are not ultimately possible, since the narrative and what they consider reasonable has changed so much from what everybody considered reasonable in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, somebody actually, we had one comment. I just wanted to read this and see what you think. And this isn't ours, and anything that we've read or comments like that are not comments of the show. We certainly have some questions and thoughts of our own, as we've expressed, but someone wrote in, we see this government enacting segregationist policies we haven't seen since the South African apartheid regime or Jim Crow segregation in the US South in the past. Seems to be no slackening of the government's appetite for more and more restrictions. So is it time to call this government what it is, an apartheid segregationist regime? Is it time that fact was acknowledged to the world, that the Canadian government is an apartheid government that's practicing an aggressive, inflammatory campaign against its own citizens and institutionalizing segregation and discrimination? That was the comment.
Yeah, and you know, in a way, that comment dovetails with what Saman had just asked, because really it's a question of, you know, when are we at the point? And I'll just, you know, correct, you know, the person saying, you know, nothing since South African apartheid. I hope the person appreciates that the South Africans came to Canada to study our model on how we treated the Aboriginals. And, you know, it wasn't until Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights in the 1950s that, you know, you could leave a reserve without having written permission, which would have a time limit on it, in your pocket, or you'd be arrested. And if you didn't get back in time, you could be arrested. Like, that just ended in the 50s with the Bill of Rights. So, you know, Section 6 of our charter, our mobility rights, that's a significant issue. And that wasn't long ago. Like 1950 was not long ago. So now there's people alive that couldn't leave their reserve.
I think most people don't know that.
Without written permission from a federal government agent. Like, so, you know, we're not this happy-go-lucky country, and I can assure you we've had two legal systems for a long time. And if you were touching a nerve, you'd learn that there's two systems. So, and you know, the first people that found that out were early lawyers dealing with native rights issues. So, you know, phones tapped, house broken into, followed, the whole thing. Like, that's Canada. I've experienced it. It's here. We've been a police state for a long time. We just didn't realize that there were two systems. So, but, you know, again, it's just, what are you willing to tolerate? I mean, a lot of people are willing to tolerate all of this. I mean, a lot of people are happy. I mean, we just had the example of, you know, people from Sweden or whatever with their digital ID. I mean, I know people that think this is cool. Like, so there's been, we deliberately have not been taught that we have to stand up for rights and that we have to cherish rights, and that's actually our responsibility. This generation has a responsibility to pass on to the next generation a Canada that's free, where rights are respected. And if we don't actually teach the generations that are following us to cherish rights and actually be willing to fight for them, even if it means giving their lives, it's a constant process, because we can't get around from human nature. And, you know, Lord Acton's dictum that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We're never going to get away from that. And the problem I think we have is well, our education system's been co-opted. And and B, we've just had it so easy. I mean, it's kind of like, you have somebody, make whole tons of money, and now the family's rich and the second generation's fine, and by the third generation wastes it because they failed to appreciate the hardship to create it in the first place and took it for granted. And that's where we are with our rights. We've just wasted it. I mean, our generation's in control. The three of us on this call, it's our age groups. And we've just sat on our asses while our country's become a full-on police state. And I think part of it was fear and part of it was shock. And it's every time you're in a war, the other side kind of plows over you for a while because you weren't expecting it. And it literally, like Korean War, they were right on the wall. It's funny, I just started a series on Pacific War, first book, Pacific Crucible. I mean, Japan was overrunning the British and the Americans and everyone until, everyone caught their breath and learned how to fight and got the will to fight. And I think we're just at that stage now where people are starting to fight back.
I was saying that to somebody recently. Just my father fought for Canada in the Second World War and risked his life. He was in a crew. Basically, they were doing bombing runs from Britain to German PT boats so that the PT boats wouldn't scuttle the D-Day invasion and take out the big ships. But of their original crew of 30 planes, 27 were shot down, killed, or captured. He was captured. And so, I mean, he went through hell to preserve our rights. And
well, I know. I mean, and
we're fighting, and now we're fighting. The enemy was on the outside then. It was Nazi Germany. It was obvious. It was clear. But it seems in this situation and struggle, the enemy's inside. It's our own system and government that are.
Or we don't even know who the enemy is, and just their agents are in our government.
Yeah. One thing I was going to ask, and this is to do about, again, what can people do? There was years ago, when I read that note we'd been sent from somebody about, and they referred to South Africa and the South African regime. But years ago, there was a friend I made here. He was from South Africa, from Soweto, part of the ANC. He had left South Africa during apartheid. And he had left basically, he was being hunted. They wanted to kill him. And so he had to escape the country, got asylum in Canada. Canada embraced him, but he was able here to be part of the sort of worldwide campaign at that point to put pressure on the South African government with sanctions and so on. So he was involved with that in terms of, identifying companies that were supporting the South African government's policies, their apartheid policies. So that's a question that someone asked me recently is, well, there's 10 to 20% of people, let's say 20% that were either in Canada that were either not vaccinated or had one shot and then an adverse reaction, maybe another 10 or 15% that don't want to get that booster. So it's growing, say 30, 35%, it's 40%, it's moving up. We don't know what that number is exactly, but more and more people are saying, wait a minute here. So just like the South African resistance put economic pressure on their government, is that a possibility too? Should we be thinking about these companies that are going along with the government and creating mandatory vaccine requirements of their employees? Now, you talked about liability issues, but what about people voting with their wallets?
This morning I sent an email to the Hershey company in the United States saying I'm not buying Hershey chocolate because they just started firing employees that wouldn't be vaccinated. I mean, I sent an email this morning, and if everyone, I've already told you how dare you use that passport for anything, but get off those social media platforms that are censoring, and we all know who they are, and get on alternative ones. We have to stop supporting any company that is, moving us towards the police state and censorship. Absolutely. I think what you've said, Patrick, is the key. I mean, we have to start voting. how can we use a company that censors or supports this? And again, I don't care whether you're vaccinated or not. That is not the issue. Us losing our rights to choose, because like I say, next time when it's a health decision you don't agree with, you're going to feel differently. Like, think this through. Do you know there's only one group of people, there's one class of people in this world who don't get to make their own health decisions? And there's a lot of them, and they're called slaves. We have a lot of slaves in 2022 in our world. It's crazy, the amount of people actually in slavery. Slaves don't get to make their health decisions, their owner does. Just like if you're a rancher, you decide whether you're going to have the vet work on your horse or cow. Human beings that are free make their own health decisions. That's the most fundamental right there is. And so if you're going to give up your most fundamental right, they're all going to follow. You're a slave, and your kids are a slave. Do you want your kids to be a slave? Are you kidding? Like, so 10 years from now or 15 years from now, when your son calls and says, oh, you know, your grandson, little Timmy's got this problem, and you know, our doctor's saying this treatment's really going to be bad news for him. The government says Timmy's got to take it. So,
Yeah.
you know, thanks, Dad. Thanks, Mom, for setting this precedent for us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And but at least we're thankful the government's now letting us out of our cage for 2 hours a day, because we've been much better. We're learning. We're doing better. Thanks, Dad and Mom. That's where we are.
Yeah.
We're at the tipping point. We're at the tipping point.
You know, I think a lot of people, you know, one thing I hear from a lot of people, and Simone and I have talked about this as well, is I think they think, you know, when I've tried to share some of these points that you brought up without all the information you were so wonderfully supplying us today, and for our listeners and viewers, but just the simple parts of it I knew, the response I get from people is they can't really argue on the facts, because I'll show them some data and so forth that I've seen. I'll show them slides, I'll show them things released from government websites and so forth, and they go, well, yeah, but you know, it's just temporary. They think it's all temporary. They think, well, you know, it's a temporary measure because of a health emergency. It's all going to go away. And I thought, well, I want to believe that too. That sounds pretty optimistic. So I was watching to see how the government was going to react when, you know, as Omicron became the dominant variant, and all of the sort of reputable virologists and immunologists were saying, well, you know, this really looks like the kind of mild variant that usually signals the end of a pandemic or switch from pandemic to endemic. Everybody gets it because it's very transmissible, but it's much, much less deadly, and we get true herd immunity. And so this is a really good sign. And I thought, well, okay, that's the signal that maybe we're coming out of this you know, crazy time, and the government's going to recognize that and lighten up. And so I was watching what was happening, but I'm not seeing any signs of lightening up. It's just like, it seems like the government sort of took a week to catch their breath, and now they've pivoted. And even with our provincial, there was a press conference, and it was absolutely bizarre, Shawn, because it was like 10 minutes of the health person talking, who was like the point person for the pandemic, and then the health minister, and they were going 10 minutes one, 10 minutes the other. So the person for the pandemic person, the spokesperson, so they'd come on and they'd say, well, this is what we're seeing about Omicron, and it looks like we're going to start moving towards endemic and treating it more as a, you know, endemic disease. And I'm going, okay, well, that's good. And then the health minister come on and go, and that means you really need your booster. and the only way we're going to beat this. And I'm going, like, there's such a disconnect. Right. And so it became really evident from that point, this campaign isn't ending. Like, this is not, they're just pivoting, and they're just going to, they're going to find rationales, because they've got whatever control they feel over the majority through the media. They're telling them what to think, and they're going to keep this going. They're going to keep this program going, and to hell with the science, and to hell with what Omicron really represents.
And to hell with being a human being and having sovereignty over your body.
Yeah.
You know what kind of ticked me off, I think it was last night, is so we've got the trucker convoy to Ottawa, but we also have in Alberta some truckers that are blocking Highway 2 just above the border at Coots. And the RCMP had, showed up at and said, listen, and there's videos, I think you can get them off Theo Fleury's Twitter feed, video of the RCMP, confronting some people. It looked like they were all in a bar, and they're saying, well, we want to talk to somebody. We're not gonna leave. And the RCMP saying, well, we're going to seize your trucks. And then thankfully the Blood Reserve have set up another roadblock on another highway. So, but Kenny's giving a press conference, basically telling the truckers to bug off, and his podium says, get the booster. Like, these people are just relentless. Like, they just can't stop. And like, does Premier Kenny not understand he could be in jail for the rest of his life if, what people are worried about happening happens? Because the evidence, if it turns out that these jabs are as dangerous as some of the and some really high caliber experts are saying, if that pans out, and let's hope it doesn't pan out, how are people like Premier Kenny going to avoid imprisonment? Like, I don't understand it. And yet they're so brazen and just push on. Like, I'm just going, like, do you not know what the law is? Like, do you not know that you have a responsibility to educate yourself? Like, you're taking away fundamental rights and just pure propaganda to enforce us to take an action that could be dangerous. Like, how do you think you're going to be okay at the end of this? Like, and we haven't even started that dialogue. We're starting it on this show. I think this is the first show where we're starting to talk about liability in Canada. Like, do these people think they're going to be free? Yeah, you can tell us we can't leave our homes, but like, do you think you're not going to be in a jail cell? Like, I'm looking at this and going, like, unless they do succeed with the social credit system, like, the people are going to stop this, and there's going to be an investigation, and there's going to be consequences. Like, that's how the rule of law works.
And it's kind of a damned if you do and damned if you don't, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I'm praying. I mean, I know from my own vaccine reaction, I have nights where, I wake up with chest pains. My wife's works in the film industry, and there's been 4 or 5 people that have just dropped dead unexpectedly in the last couple months or less. Healthy guys, some relatively young. So, and there's just so many cases I've seen of people having those kinds of things, or neurological things, headaches, other kinds of issues. So, I don't, when I talk to some of my double vaccinated friends who are really, really on board and drank the Kool-Aid with the government program and the media program, I say, look, just go see somebody about a detox. Like, just look into, some of the information that's out there about the types of adverse reactions are, and do a detox. Get whatever may not be good for your system or toxic for your system out of there. Because that's my fear when I say damned if you do, damned if you don't. On the one hand, I don't want my friends, or a lot of my friends, to develop these conditions down the line. I don't know what's going to happen with what's developed into some kind of heart condition for me down the line, and I don't want to see an epidemic of vaccine side effects come out of this. But on the other hand, because people are so far into buying what they've been selling, it's almost like, unless that happens, or some extent of that happens, people are just going to go along with the program. And so it's kind of a weird position to be in. I don't want people to get sick, but I also know as they're getting sick, like I'll give you an example. My brother also, he's been having chest pain since he got his double vaccination. A friend of mine has been getting migraines, and there's just an endless list of them. But my brother, he finally got onto it and realized, Jesus, I might not make it through the next night. So he's getting some treatment and some stuff for that. But a lot of these other people are just, they're they're going, well, it couldn't be the vaccine. Like when I got chest pains, I got the vaccine, the dose I got chest pains that night, and I had them for 3 nights. And I was just on the edge on the 3rd night or the 2nd night of going, should I go to the hospital? Because they weren't severe, but they were there. And I'd never had anything like that in the center of my chest. And so, but I thought, I didn't want to believe it was the vaccine. I wanted to be one of the good ones. I was on, these are good. I believe the government, they're safe. I believe the health authorities. I don't want to be one of those crazy ones saying that it could be a vaccine side effect. So friends said, well, maybe it was just referred pain. You laid on your shoulder where you were jabbed and it was referred pain to the middle of your chest. I went, yeah, that must be it. And then a month later, I'm out walking. Whoop, there it is again. And then, within a few nights, at night, it's there once in a while. So I'm taking some stuff now that seems to be helping, but, so I don't know where that's going to go. And I think but because I didn't want to believe, I disregarded that for the first 3 days. I didn't treat it really for the first month or 2. And that's the situation I see, is that all these friends I have that I've talked about this kind of thing to, well, they don't really want to think it was the vaccine that did it to me. And whatever they're going through, they don't want to believe that either. So if they drop dead in 2 months or 6 months or a year, or their conditions they have get much worse and become chronic or life-threatening, they're not going to believe it. Or by the time they believe it, they're gone, and they're just a statistic, and they're going to be written up as, oh, well, that had nothing to do with the vaccine. That was 8 months ago. So,
well, I think, yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it, Patrick? I think we're all kind of hoping, like, first of all 3 of us want to be called fools a year from now.
Yeah.
Like I've never wanted to be wrong more in my life than, right now, where I'm thinking, just trying to avoid that bright spot, where I'm, thinking that likely a large number of people are going to either get really sick, and a large number already are really sick and disabled, and, many are going to die. Like, I want to be wrong on that. When I see real experts talking about them having these concerns, and then using real live statistical data to go, but it seems like this is how it's playing out. So unless the data curves change, this is where we're going. I mean, I hope they're wrong. I hope they're wrong. If we could have a podcast in a year and you guys say, oh, Buckley, you crazy alarmist, you. Okay, yeah. You're right. Well, yeah, let's play a clip. Was that ever stupid? That's
absolutely. What everybody's healthy. The mandate's gone. All the restrictions are gone. Passport's gone. I would love that. Wouldn't that be nice? But
if the experts are right, then we're in for a world of hurt. And the sooner, because if the experts are right, it means that, in a generous scenario, the governments have pushed a treatment that turned out to be horribly dangerous. This is a generous scenario, and then just stuck with it longer than they should have. None of us believe it's that simple, but that's a generous scenario. Well, then it's not going to stop until either we demand that it stop, or until enough people are dying or being disabled that you just, no, I'm sorry, you can't deny this anymore. Like, what was it, 3 weeks ago now? I forget the CEO and I forget the insurance company, but I know I saved the links in the report, where he's doing a report to shareholders. And it's a big company, and he's saying, look, in 2021, we have had a 40% increase over 2020, which really was an average year. Mortality goes up and down for different reasons, but it wasn't 2020. Listen, there weren't more in any country people dying in 2020 than other statistical averages, and that was the first year of our global pandemic. Check it out, people. But in 2021, they have a 40% increase in deaths. I think it's the age 19 to 64 group, so our working age population. That is not explained by COVID deaths. Now, what he explained apparently in that presentation, and I'm just relying on a third-party news report, So I haven't verified it, but what it was reported is listen, insurance companies plan for big events, and like a once every 200-year catastrophe, they would expect a 10% increase in mortality. So this 40%, and he says other insurance companies are finding the same things, and he says it's consistent with the CDC data on deaths. We're dying.
Yeah.
And we're dying in a way we've never died before. And the one change is this mass jabbing.
I saw even before, just before we started the interview, just as sort of a symbol of that, 2 ambulances pulled out outside our complex. There's about 1,000 people that live in 3 buildings here, or 700 to 1,000, and they seem to be coming more often. Though that's anecdotal, but what my wife's seeing in her industry, and the amount of suddenly unexplained deaths of males in that category, in that demographic, the insurance video was about. It's there. And again, unfortunately, most of it is going to be chalked up to completely unrelated.
But it's part of the propaganda. So for example, I'm living in Alberta right now. And a couple of months ago, all these electronic billboards, how they flash through different things. And one of them was, 95% of people in ICU are the unvaxxed. Well, if you're just seeing that or hearing it on TV, and I've heard, who Cliff High calls the normies, use this. Well, 95% of people in ICUs are unvaxxed. Well, it was a sitting politician. I won't use the person's name. I've not verified this, so I'm just relying on this person, who said, but the first part we all know is you're considered unvaxxed until a full 14 days after your second shot. So when they're saying the unvaxxed in the ICU, it's 95% of the unvaxxed are filling our ICU wards. Well, the definition of unvaxxed is somebody who has not lived to the 15th day after their second shot. So we've had, I'm using US now, their VAERS system. I don't know how long that's been in play. Like we've in Canada, our adverse reaction reporting system, I think started in 1965 after the thalidomide disaster. I don't know when theirs started, but apparently, you could add up all the vaccine deaths from every vaccine pre-COVID jab, and we've had more deaths from the COVID jabs than all other vaccine deaths from all other vaccines that we've recorded.
In history, yeah, since
in history. So
Dr. Jessica Rose, when we interviewed her, said the same thing, and actually had a chart that we showed in that interview as well. It's just stunning, because you basically got this little line, which is vaccine reactions from all the years prior to the COVID vaccine, and then it goes way up like that, just like spikes to the sky.
Yeah. So getting back to the propaganda, 95% of people in ICU are unvaccinated. Well, so anyone having an adverse reaction after the first jab at any time, I mean, they can choose, and they're there for a vaccine reaction, they're counted as the unvaxxed.
Mm-hmm.
You're most likely to have your adverse reaction within 2 weeks. So, even after the second shot, the majority of adverse, I have to take that back, because some of the experts are saying nobody gets away from this one scot-free, unless you were in one of the batches that deliberately was, non-toxic. But, if you took the real deal, I mean, some experts are saying you're hurt. But as far as, being in intensive care, I mean, literally the truth could be that, the intensive care wards are being overrun because of vaccine injuries. But because of the way the message is crafted, the public are now afraid those unvaxxed people, they're taking up all our health care. Like if I get sick, there's not an ICU bed for me. And in Alberta, and this is where the politician had said that I hadn't verified, they said, well, actually, if you ask them and look behind this, they're actually also just using a time frame. And of course, they have to be using the time frame. And the time frame included a period where in Alberta you really couldn't get your second shot anyway. So by definition, anyone in the ICU was unvaxxed, regardless of why they're there.
Yeah, because I haven't seen
Right? Like, they could be there because of a motorcycle accident,
Right.
but they're there as the unvaxxed. And I can say it was, I mean, the statistics, like how they just try to any death is, you know, COVID. I mean, I had somebody close to me die in 2021, and I was in the hospital in the room when this person died. I was there all day. The person, you know, was going to die. The person was very old, close to 90, had a condition that was causing the death that had nothing to do with COVID. We all know this. The hospital isn't even giving treatment. The person is just there to die. I bet you it was 25 times we had to refuse a COVID test because they just wanted to get a positive so she could be a statistic.
Yeah.
It was outrageous. Why would you test somebody who just gone there to die of a pre-existing condition? You're not even treating them. They're just, we all know they're dying that day, that calendar day. It, you know, it took till the night. And we were just hounded and hounded and hounded for them to be tested for COVID. Like, it was outrageous how they want to stuff these statistics. It was maddening.
Well, that's what we've been hearing as well in terms of the statistics. I mean, we've been hearing about 85% of the people with Omicron that are hospitalized are double vaxxed, but 50% of the ICU folks in ICU are it's 50-50 between vaxxed and unvaxxed. But yeah, as you're saying.
But why are they there? Are they there for other reasons? That's the problem.
Exactly.
That whole thing is meaningless. The whole ICU ward could be filled up with no one's got COVID or there for COVID.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. People are being
and I'm not saying that some strains of COVID, and especially in certain cohorts, don't cause death and don't cause serious illness. But it's just when we crunch the numbers, it hasn't proven to be any worse than a really bad influenza season. And we've never shut down like this. And we've never lost our fundamental freedom. So I'm not minimizing the issue, but we've acted in such a dangerous way in how we've dealt with it.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a statistic I actually looked up on the BC government charts, website of fatalities, and by years, and it was interesting to see. I'm actually going to do another video about that at some point, but on the chart they showed 2020, so the first year of the pandemic, and what the fatality rate was, or the overall fatalities. And it was interesting to see that 2017 had more fatalities. We had more deaths in BC in 2017 than 2020. And they showed in 2020, it's COVID. In 2017, it was what was called severe flu on the government website. So we had more deaths from severe flu in 2017 than we had from COVID in 2020. And in fact, the difference, and when I looked dug a little deeper, drilled a little down on the numbers and the charts. So in 2017, the deaths were very close. They were a little higher in 2017, but what in 2020 was being called COVID was being called, there were almost the equivalent amount of deaths, but they were lower respiratory disease. That's what the cause of death was declared as. So I'm not saying, obviously that COVID isn't, a disease or a severe flu, but there was obviously a more severe flu in 2017 that also had lower respiratory disease and a high number of deaths from that, as we've seen from the deaths in COVID. That's often what they're attributed to. So even the government chart says, well, it's somewhere around severe or just below severe flu based on those statistics. But in 2021, as you're saying, things are changing and something else started happening.
Yeah, it can't be explained by like the facts. Like that's the weird thing, right? And it was one of the early red flags for me because, early on when we started this in 2020, there were on the internet a lot of health officials or former health officials, so people that have worked their whole career, putting videos out going, well, yeah, this is bad, but it's not as bad as other ones we've had, and we've never reacted this way. And then, reports started coming in. I mean, we were having, like in some states, more suicides than COVID deaths because of the lockdowns.
Yeah.
Think of all the mental health problems. I mean, Dr. Malone, on his Joe Rogan interview, one of the things that really saddened me was when he started talking about how, the cognitive abilities in kids are being stunted because, they have to take we're wired in our brains as we're at a certain age to take social cues from expressions, and everyone's wearing masks, and they're wearing masks. I think he said the IQ was down 20 points or something like that, the average IQ in a certain age group. Like we're so damaging our kids that it's just absolutely crazy. And there's been no risk benefit analysis from what we're doing. Like, it's just kind of like, no, we've been funneled from the beginning to get jabbed, which, you can forgive some people for wondering, well, like, was that the whole point in the first place? So you've kind of skewed a narrative to create fear, kept us all hyped up, taken rights away, which also creates fear. Wearing masks creates fear. Like, that's not normal. And then we're all funneled into this one solution, and then the government just creates pressure that's outrageous. And then companies go along with it. It's like,
and that's the thing. I think the fact we are where we're at now in the whole evolution of this, that with Omicron, we've got that mild variant that so many experts are saying that heralds the end of the pandemic. We have to deal with it. Great Britain, lots of countries are ending restrictions. They're dealing with it as a matter of life, as a flu. So I think this is really a key thing is Canada going to follow the rest of the world and begin to live with this and begin to follow the science, or are they going to continue to restrict Canadians' rights, restrict everyone that's listening to this program, your rights, your freedom of movement, your ability to determine what goes in your body? Are you going to need to keep taking boosters, even if you've done okay with the first two, that next one or the one after that, if your body starts to break down? And I have lots of friends, they were okay with the first one or the second one, but it's that booster that got them, or maybe it was a second shot. At some point, if you want to get off that roller coaster, unless this stops, unless this whole program stops and we follow the countries that are showing some sanity like Britain, and let go of this program and start dealing with this as a normal fact of life, then we have that kind of problem that you've been talking about, Shawn. And I just want to thank you, because I know we've gone a little bit over here. We went a couple hours, but it's been a fascinating discussion. And I know you were moving around a little bit to escape the light, but I think you've been shedding the light for a lot of people and for Canadian citizens on a very important issue. So I just want to really.
Well, I thank you guys for what you're doing, because you've asked what can people do, and you guys have decided, well, we're going to do podcasts and we're going to get people on and just try to expose people to other views. And I don't expect people to agree with me, but thank you for listening to my views and having a different opinion than yours, maybe, or a different perspective. A different point of view is by definition a view from a point where you are not. That's a different point of view. It's a view from a point where you are not. And I found myself, because this is such a passionate issue, I have to check my information bias, because we're all so happy to accept information, myself included, that confirms what I believe, whether I believe rightly or wrongly. And so we all have to be checking our information biases, and be careful about if we haven't verified things to say so and stuff like that. But you guys are doing great work, and you're an example then other people. So even people watching, this and other podcasts, even just sharing it is something they can do, and supporting you guys is something that they can do.
Well, we'd love
So-
we'd love to, and on that, in that vein, we would love to have you come back if you can make some time after your honeymoon to perhaps do an interview with former Premier Brian Peckford on the constitutional issues. And and as a middle way podcast, we're trying to actually stay balanced on issues and show both sides of things, and look at a lot of other types of issues and things that are concerning people and in our own personal growth and lives and happiness. So and in that attempt to have balance and show both sides, we would even be happy to invite a government representative on to talk with you and former Premier Brian Peckford about the constitutional side and what is that perspective on the Charter of Rights and when do our rights and freedoms begin to become in effect again. So I'd love to hear from them on that.
I can tell you it'd be an honor and a treat to be on with Brian Peckford, because I was a young man when I'm 57. I was a young man when 82 was there, but I was following it, and then I just became fascinated, and I read account after account of them in the cafeteria of the Chateau Laurier, late at night doing this stuff. So he's a legend for me. So obviously it would be a total treat to be on a show with Mr. Peckford.
That would be brilliant. Well, we'll try to set it up, and we'll stay in touch with you, but we're going to try not to interfere with the honeymoon or the fun you're having with the palm trees on the prairies.
That's right. Yeah.
I guess so. Thanks so much. And this has been the Middle Way Podcast with Pat and Simon and our very good guest, Shawn Buckley. Thank you, Shawn.
You're welcome. Thank you.